If you're a student thinking of moving to Paris, this video is for you. Keep watching it. Studying abroad is a new opportunity and an incredible experience, but at the same time, it is living in unusual and new conditions, away from family and friends. It takes some time to adapt. Here are some tips to make this process go faster and easier.
Okay, we will first start with the Mexican culture. The Mexican culture is characterized by being an open culture with high context communication and polychronic actions. Of course, there are many similarities with the French culture, but there are also some stumbling blocks that limit interaction between the two. So for this reason, in order to successfully communicate with the French culture being a Mexican, I invite you to follow this advice. First, don't talk loudly at public places, since here people will look bad at you. I know when we're with our friends, when we're at a bar or restaurant, we tend to talk really loudly because we get very excited, but here you cannot do that. Second of all, you should be very polite and greet everyone. Here, politeness is key. So when you go to a supermarket, to any store, to the bakery, you should always be polite and greet the people. Last but not least, be on time, please. I know we as Mexicans struggle a lot with this aspect and we're always late to our appointments or often, and also we leave things until the last second, like looking for housing. This I strongly recommend that you are on time and you manage your time correctly so you can find an apartment at the right time and don't end up living in a hotel for the first part of your exchange here.
If you're a Brazilian student planning to come and study in France, here are a few tips that I think you should know before coming. First, it's possible to say that as a whole, things in Brazil run a little bit differently here than here in France. For instance, it's very common in Brazil to solve things through conversation and explain yourself at the time of the conversation, whereas in France, they tend to stick to rules previously decided and follow them in every situation. So as a Brazilian in France, their recommendation is to get out of your comfort zone and always try to be prepared for every possible situation, since you can't just figure it out at the moment of the conversation. Another thing that I think is different in Brazil is that we're very used to speaking in English if necessary, and we don't mind doing it. We actually think it's pretty fun and use it as an opportunity to practice. However, here in France, French like that you at least try to communicate in French before speaking in English. It's kind of an act of respect towards their culture, so it's important to learn at least the basics before coming so you can have better communication. And in Brazil, there's the fact they're very communicative. We make conversation everywhere we go, and even with strangers. So it's common to make conversations with people you just met. For instance, I have already talked with Uber drivers about my personal life and was getting very nice advice from them. In France, people like to keep their lives more private. So try not to overshare in a conversation, otherwise it might get a little uncomfortable or weird. However, one thing in common that we have with the French people is that we like to greet people everywhere we go, so that should be easy for you. Just learn how to say bonjour instead of saying bon dia, and you're good to go.
My recommendation would be first to treat French people more carefully and place importance on the non-verbal elements of the communications. And my last piece of advice from me to you, dear exchange student, is that if you're in your exchange and your French professor, for example, does not answer your emails and you're lost, just figure it out, because yes, you will be able, and don't overstress and don't give off these anger vibes, because this is not how French culture works.
France is characterized for being a more individualistic society, which this means they normally are tough to take care of themselves, their uniqueness, and their families. They are more autonomous. For example, an individualistic society, like in this case is France, they are more unique. They are distinguish themselves from others. Also, they enjoy of a higher status, and they also express their uniqueness in their surroundings around their society. In the other hand, in comparison with Mexico, Mexico has a lower individualistic score, which that means Mexico is characterized for being a more collectivist society. And this is best represented by fostering strong relationships and loyalty in different groups, for example, families, extended relationships, etc. An example of a collectivist society, like in this case, it's Mexico. It's best represented by where a family or a group of people work together as a group in order to achieve a certain goal, objective, etc. This is how collectivist society works, and that's how they function in real life. For another example, comparing France and Mexico, is that Mexican people involve people more and are very talkative. and the French people are not like that. They count with different cultures, way of seeing things, and how they see things like around their societies, cultures, etc. So we see a really big difference between France being an individualistic society and Mexico being a more collectivist society.
Regarding the power distance index, both Brazil and France have a high power distance index, which means that both cultures tend to accept a hierarchical order of power, and even though in Brazil people do question and demand justification for the inequality, most of the people don't. And just learn to live with it since it's something that is very strongly structured already. However, in terms of masculinity and femininity, both countries differ in terms that in Brazil people are very driven towards achievements, and your success is measured through them. Whereas in France, society tends to be more cooperative and focus on quality of life instead of reaching big goals and material rewards.
Following, Peruvian culture is defined to be generally helpful, and sometimes some things are considered personal might not be considered personal here. Our interests and success are emphasized as an entire group and not as an individual. So this is why we are a high collectivistic culture. As an example, if you order a taxi in Peru, it's really common that the taxi starts asking questions like, are you married? Are you single? Where do you study? What do you study? And this type of questions. My advice here is, for example, if you order a taxi in France, do not expect them to have this reaction and this conversation with you. So don't stereotype French people as rude, because they are not. They are simply following a more individualistic culture. France and Peru are very similar regarding the power index culture. We both have to call our bosses and superiors Mr. and Mrs. Our respect towards inequalities are really important for us. So here we don't differentiate that much. So my advice would be to follow what you usually do and always with some extra respect.
The French communication style is described as a high context. They pay a lot of attention to the body language, the facial expression, the nonverbal communication, and they might be more unspeaking than explicit.
In terms of communication style, Brazilian culture can be considered high context with much use of nonverbal communication, like hugging, smiling all the time, a lot of body language while speaking. However, Brazilians like their personal space. We feel very comfortable hugging and touching people that we know, but we don't do that with whom we do not have a certain proximity with, being a little uncomfortable in situations where that happens. Even though communication is similar between French and Brazilians, the French do not care so much about having that much personal space. An example of that is the metro. In Brazil, we'd rather stay up rather than sit down in the seats that are too close to each other. And the distance between tables in restaurants is much bigger than here in France. But both tend to have the overlapping kind of conversation. Like, we can be in a conversation and everyone is talking. So that's great for Brazilians when having conversations here, since it's something that we are already used to.
I'd like to start by saying that Peru is made up of diverse ethnic cultures, and we're considered a low context culture compared to other Latin American countries, but we're still ranked in a high context culture. We communicate in a more direct way, and we're considered to be friendly and warm, but we often give these anger vibes when we feel that something we don't like or we don't agree. In France, which they're also a high context culture, this is shown as unprofessional and immature. In Peru, we base our relationships on trust and family, so it's common for us to close a deal by only shaking hands. Overall, France's communication may be more unspoken, ambiguous, and nuanced. There is less instruction, and they expect more of a figure-it-out mindset. This is why we don't differentiate that much in communication, since in Peru, we are also sometimes in the unclear.
Mexican culture tends to be so flexible when it comes to time management. As a culture, we have a polychronic understanding of time, meaning that we can easily achieve many things at the same time. When it comes to making business decisions or negotiating, Mexicans also have a polychronic working style. Mexicans tend to prioritize personal relationships, so when it comes to business, they start making connections and relationships at the same time that they are negotiating or talking about business.
Brazilian culture is characterized as high context, with polychronic actions being similar to the French culture in this way, which facilitates communication. But something that definitely differentiates the two cultures is the way of thinking. French people tend to have a monochromatic way of thinking. They are prepared and very organized. Everything is done in a logical way. However, that is not how it works in Brazil, where it's common to try and solve things through conversation, like I mentioned.
Peruvians tend to be more fluid and flexible. We like to multitask and we don't make drama when things have to be arranged affecting other plans or ideas we had before. So we're described as an polychronic culture. And when it comes to time, for us Peruvians, punctuality is not as important as it should be, and arriving late is kind of normal. To a certain extent, we tolerate time a lot because for us it's even expected. If you're a Peruvian and a friend invites you to a party at 8 p.m., you are usually going to arrive at 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. It's considered okay for us to arrive 3 to 4 hours later than you were invited. And as mentioned before, France tends to be in the middle. So for this reason, I recommend that if you're in your exchange and a new French friend invites you to a party at 8 p.m., do not arrive at 11 p.m. because this might be considered rude.
We chose to talk about the dimensions of power distance index, collectivism versus individualism, and masculinity versus femininity because we consider that each country has its own individualities, and these differences within each culture shapes their way of being, and it is a route for understanding why some cultures are the way they are, and also why for some of us it's difficult to adapt or to successfully communicate to every culture, for example the French culture, and as well you can see kind of their personalities.
In terms of communication styles, both Mexican and French culture tend to be very expressive, with high context, and emphasis on the body language, but they also have their difference in the terms how they meet, how they greet each other, and how they transfer information among others, like the way they see each other. Communication styles was chosen because we believe it's a very important aspect to know and to understand, because since we are humans, we need to communicate and to achieve it in the best way. Understanding the difference between the countries and the cultures ensures an optimal development and give us a better understanding on how to relate to one another in an effective way.
Last but not least, the monochronic and polychronic types of behavior gives us a better understanding of each culture, since we wanted to know or we wanted to see how different or similar our countries were from each other in terms of behavior. It gives us very important information and insights such as our time management and ways of organization. It enables us to understand better our own culture as well as other cultures.
In conclusion, all cultures have different point of views and forms of acting, but it is easy to adapt when you already analyze them. Studying abroad is a great opportunity that we recommend every student has. It is something new and sometimes it can be terrifying, but it is like everything in life. We hope you enjoyed this video and you take our tips in advice.